My mother showed up at my desk in the middle of the loan department and said it loud enough for David at the next cubicle to hear every word. You think you can just keep living like none of this matters to you anymore? Your sister has carried every single family discussion about the property while you've been too busy playing independent woman to even pick up the phone. People in this town are talking, Lauren. They're asking me why my own daughter acts like she's too good for the rest of us. If you don't start showing up and proving you still care about this family, there won't be any decisions left for you to weigh in on. Your sister and I are finished making excuses for you. Decide right now whose side you're on. Hi, my name is Lauren Mitchell. I am 30 years old. I sat there with a half-finished loan file open on my screen, the pen still in my hand, while my mother's words settled over the quiet afternoon hum of the bank. My coworker David glanced over once, then quickly looked back at his monitor. I could feel the heat rising in my face, but I didn't move. I just nodded once, the smallest motion, and said I would call her later. She turned and walked out with my sister Brooke right behind her, neither of them looking back. That was the day everything I thought I knew about my family started to come apart piece by piece, in ways I had never let myself see before. I had grown up in Willow Creek, Missouri, on the edge of the old Mitchell property that had been in our family for 3 generations. My father passed when I was in high school, and after that, my mother and sister kept the place running with the help of a few steady neighbors and the occasional hired hand. I stayed close for a while after college, working odd jobs and helping with whatever needed doing on weekends. When the bank offered me a steady position as a loan processor 2 years ago, I took it. The hours were predictable. The pay was decent for a small town, and I could still drive out to the property most Sunday afternoons without too much trouble. I thought that was enough. I thought showing up when I could and sending money for repairs when they asked was the same as being present. Looking back now, I can see how easy it was for small silences to grow into something larger. The morning after my mother's visit to the bank, I stopped at the grocery store on my way home from work. Mrs. Ellison was in the produce aisle, the same woman who had lived across the road from our property since before I was born. She had always been kind in that quiet, watchful way small-town neighbors are. She smiled when she saw me and asked how the loan work was going. Then she said, almost as an afterthought, "Your mother mentioned you've been pulling away from the family discussions about the property. She said you told her you didn't have time to keep driving out for every little thing anymore." I stood there holding a bag of apples, trying to remember if I had ever said those exact words. I hadn't. I had said I couldn't make it to one particular meeting because of a work deadline. That was all. Mrs. Ellison kept talking, her voice gentle, like she was just passing along information. She said my mother and sister had been handling most of the decisions lately, and that it seemed to be working out fine without me. She didn't mean it as an attack. She was just repeating what she had heard. I paid for my groceries and drove home with my hands tight on the steering wheel. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold, turning the conversation over in my mind. I kept coming back to the same question. How many other people had heard versions of that story? The next weekend, I drove out to the property anyway, even though no one had asked me to come. My mother was on the porch with Brooke when I pulled up. They both looked surprised to see me, but not in a warm way. My mother asked if everything was all right at the bank, as if my showing up unannounced must mean something had gone wrong with my job. Brooke stayed quiet, scrolling on her phone, only glancing up once to say the roof on the old barn needed fixing, and that they had already gotten an estimate. I offered to help look at the estimate. My mother said they had already taken care of it. The way she said it made the offer feel unnecessary, almost intrusive. I stayed for an hour, mostly listening. When I left, neither of them walked me to the car. On the drive back to town, I kept thinking about Mrs. Ellison's comment, and the way my mother had looked at me on the porch like I was a guest who had arrived at the wrong time. I started remembering other moments that had felt small at the time. The family text chain about the property survey that I had been left off of. The cousin who called me asking if I was still mad at everyone, and wouldn't explain why he thought that. The way my mother had started ending phone calls with, "We'll handle it on our end," instead of asking what I thought. I didn't confront anyone right away. I told myself I was overreacting, that work had been stressful and I was reading too much into ordinary family friction. But the question stayed with me, quiet and persistent, the way a loose thread keeps catching on everything you touch. 2 weeks later, I ran into my cousin Emily at the post office. She hugged me quickly and then stepped back, her expression careful. She said she had heard I was thinking of moving farther away for work and that she understood how hard it must be to balance everything. I told her I had no plans to move. She looked confused for a second, then said my mother had mentioned it at church the previous Sunday. She changed the subject after that, but the confusion stayed on her face. That night, I sat on my couch with my laptop open, scrolling through old family photos without really seeing them. I kept coming back to one picture from 5 years earlier, all of us on the porch after a long day of clearing brush. My mother had her arm around Brooke. I was standing a little apart, smiling at the camera. I remembered feeling content that day, like I belonged there, even if I didn't live on the property anymore. Looking at it now, I wondered how many stories had already been written over that moment without me knowing. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time. The house was quiet. Outside, the town moved through its usual evening routines. I thought about calling my mother about asking her directly what she had been telling people. I thought about driving back out to the property the next morning and sitting on the porch until someone had to explain why I was being left out of conversations that used to include me. Instead, I stayed where I was, turning the same questions over, trying to decide whether speaking up would fix anything or only make the distance wider. The quiet in the room felt heavier than it should have. I kept seeing Mrs. Ellison's kind, uncertain face in the grocery store, and the way my cousin had stepped back after the hug, like she wasn't sure which version of me she was talking to. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice from the bank lobby, low and certain, telling me I had to choose a side. I still didn't know what sides existed, or when they had been drawn, or how long I had been standing on the wrong one without realizing it. The next morning, I drove to the bank with the radio off, the same questions looping in my head like a song I couldn't turn down. David was already at his desk when I walked in. He looked up, hesitated, then asked if I was all right after yesterday. I told him it was just family stuff and tried to smile. He nodded once and went back to his screen, but I could feel him watching me for the rest of the morning. By lunch, I couldn't stand the quiet anymore. I stepped outside behind the building and called my sister. Brooke answered on the third ring, her voice light in that careful way she used when she didn't want to give anything away. "I heard you stopped by the property yesterday," she said before I could speak. "Mom said you seemed upset." "I wasn't upset," I said. "I just wanted to know what was happening with the roof estimate and why I wasn't included in the text about the survey." There was a short pause. Then Brooke laughed a small, dry sound. "Lauren, you haven't been included in most of those conversations for a while now. You're always working or tired or just checking in. Mom and I figured you had enough on your plate. We didn't want to bother you." The words landed flat and cold. I gripped the phone tighter. "You could have asked." "We did ask," she said. And now the sarcasm was there, soft but sharp. "You said you couldn't make it. Then you said you'd call back. Then you didn't. At some point, we stopped waiting. It's not personal. The property still needs decisions made, and someone has to make them." I stood there in the alley behind the bank, the smell of the dumpster mixing with the exhaust from the drive-thru across the street. "So you and Mom just decided I was out?" Brooke's voice stayed even. "We decided the family couldn't keep putting things on hold because one person keeps choosing her own schedule over everyone else's. That's not turning against you, Lauren. That's just moving forward." I didn't answer right away. She waited, then said she had to go, and hung up before I could say anything else. I stayed outside for another minute, the phone still in my hand, feeling the heat rise in my chest, and then settle into something heavier. That Sunday, I went to church. I hadn't been in a few weeks, but I told myself it was time to show up. Pastor Daniels greeted people at the door the way he always did. When he saw me, he smiled, asked how the bank was treating me, then added, almost as an afterthought, that he had heard the family property discussions were moving along nicely. "Your mother and sister have been very dedicated," he said. I know it can be hard when one person's life takes them in a different direction, but it sounds like they're handling it with grace. I thanked him and kept walking. The words followed me down the aisle. Different direction. Handling it with grace. I sat through the service without hearing much of it. Afterward, I drove straight to the property instead of going home. I didn't call first. When I pulled up, my mother's car was in the driveway, and a silver sedan I didn't recognize was parked beside it. Mr. Thompson, the realtor, who had handled a few sales in town over the years, was standing on the porch with a folder in his hand. My mother and sister were beside him, both of them looking at papers spread across the railing. They all turned when I got out of the car. My mother's face tightened for a second before she smoothed it out. "Lauren," she said, "we weren't expecting you." "I can see that," I said. I walked up the steps. "What's going on?" Mr. Thompson glanced between us, clearly uncomfortable. "We were just going over some preliminary numbers for a possible sale," he said. "Nothing final yet." My sister closed the folder. "We were going to tell you once we had something solid. You've been busy." "I'm here now," I said. "Tell me." My mother looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "The property needs work. We can't keep putting off. The roof, the foundation on the barn, the taxes. We've been talking to Mr. Thompson about what the land might bring if we sold a portion. Your sister and I have been handling the conversations because you haven't been available. That's all this is." I looked at the folder in Brooke's hands. "And you didn't think to ask what I thought about selling any of it?" "You would have said no," my mother said, and her voice was calm, almost kind. "You always say no when it means change." We didn't want to fight about it again. Brooke shifted the folder against her chest. "It's not like we're doing this behind your back to hurt you. We're doing it because someone has to. If you wanted to say, you could have made time." The words were soft, but they cut straight through. I stood there on the porch I had helped paint when I was 16, looking at my mother and sister and a man I barely knew, and felt the ground shift under me in a way that had nothing to do with the old floorboards. I left without saying much else. On the drive back to town, I kept seeing the way my mother had looked at me when she said I always said no. Like it was a fact everyone already knew. That night I went up to the attic. I told myself I was looking for the old property survey my father had kept in a box somewhere. The one with the measurements and the notes in his handwriting. I needed to see the boundaries for myself. I pulled down 3 boxes before I found the right one. The survey was there, folded and faded. Underneath it was a stack of old notebooks, the kind my father used to use for everything. I opened the top one. The pages were from when I was in high school. Most of it was ordinary lists of chores, notes about the weather, a few lines about how much hay the back field had produced that year. Then I turned a page and saw my name. Lauren keeps asking why Brooke gets to decide things about the house. I told her it's because Brooke is here every day and Lauren is at school or with her friends. She didn't like that answer. Diane says we have to be careful not to let her feel left out, but the truth is, she's already choosing to be somewhere else. Maybe that's just how it is with the two of them. I read it twice. Then I turned more pages. There were more entries over the years, short and matter-of-fact, the way my father wrote everything. One from a few years after he passed, Diane and Brooke met with the accountant today. Lauren called but said she couldn't come. Diane told her we'd handle it. I think that's becoming the pattern. The last entry I could find was dated 3 years ago. It was only a few lines. Lauren says she wants to be part of the decisions, but she keeps missing the meetings. Brooke says it's because she doesn't really want the responsibility. Maybe she's right. Diane thinks we should stop asking so she doesn't feel pressured. I don't know if that's the right thing, but I'm tired of the arguments. I closed the notebook slowly. My hands felt cold even though the attic was warm. I sat there on the floor with the box open in front of me, the survey still in my lap, and listened to the quiet creak of the old house settling around me. I had spent years telling myself the distance was just life job schedules, the ordinary drift that happens when people grow up. But the pages in my hands said something else had been happening at the same time. Quiet and steady. One conversation at a time. My mother and sister hadn't just moved forward without me. They had decided years ago that I had already stepped away. I put the notebook back in the box and carried the survey downstairs. I laid it on the kitchen table and stared at the lines my father had drawn. The property looked smaller on paper than it felt in my memory. I kept thinking about the way Brooke had held that folder on the porch, and the way my mother's voice had stayed so calm when she told me I always said no. I picked up my phone. My thumb hovered over my mother's number. I could call her right now, tell her what I had found, ask her to explain the notebooks and the conversations, and why every relative I ran into seemed to already know a version of me that didn't match the one I thought I was living. Instead, I set the phone down. The house was quiet again. Outside, a car drove past on the street, its headlights sweeping across the living room wall, and then gone. I sat at the table until the tea I had made went cold, the surveys still open in front of me, and tried to decide what I was supposed to do with the truth that had been sitting in my attic for years without me knowing it was there. The next morning, I woke up with the journal page still on the kitchen table where I had left it. I read it again while the coffee brewed, the words in my father's careful handwriting looking smaller in the daylight. I folded it once and put it in my bag with the old survey. Then I drove to the property without calling first. Uncle Robert's truck was already in the driveway when I pulled up. He was my father's older brother, the one who had helped with the hay and the fences when we were kids. He stepped off the porch when he saw me and gave me the same half-smile he had used since I was small. "Lauren," he said, "didn't know you were coming out today." "I didn't either," I said. "Is Mom inside?" He nodded toward the house. "Her and Brooke and that realtor again. They've been at it since breakfast." He paused, then added, "Your mother mentioned you've been having a hard time with all this. Said you might not be in the right frame of mind for big decisions." I felt the familiar sting, the same one I had heard from Mrs. Ellison and Pastor Daniels, and now from him. I didn't argue. I just thanked him and walked past. My mother and sister were at the kitchen table with Mr. Thompson. The same folder from yesterday was open between them. When I stepped through the door, all three looked up. My mother's expression shifted from surprise to something tighter. "Lauren," she said, "we weren't expecting company." "I'm not company," I said. I pulled the folded journal page from my bag and laid it on the table next to the folder. "I found this last night. Dad wrote it years ago. He said you and Brooke had already started deciding things without me, and that you thought it was better if I didn't know." Brooke reached for the page first. She read it quickly, then set it down like it was nothing important. "Dad wrote a lot of things," she said. "He was tired a lot toward the end. He didn't always see the full picture." My mother didn't touch the page. She looked at me instead, her voice steady and low. "If you're going to start digging through old notebooks to find reasons to be angry, you could at least be honest about why you're really here. You don't want the property sold because you think it should stay exactly the way it was when you were a child. You've always wanted everything to stay the same, while the rest of us did the work." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat and stood up. "I think I'll step outside for a minute," he said. He gathered his papers and left without looking at any of us. Once the door closed, my sister leaned back in her chair. "You show up with one page from an old notebook and act like it proves something. Mom and I have been the ones here. We've been the ones answering the calls from the county and the roofers and the tax office. You've been the one with the steady job and the quiet weekends and the choice to stay away. Now you want to come in at the last minute and tell us we did it wrong?" I looked at my mother. "Is that what you've been telling everyone? That I chose to stay away?" She met my eyes without flinching. "I told them the truth. You have a life that doesn't include this place the way it used to. There's nothing shameful in that. But there's also nothing wrong with the rest of us continuing without you when you're not here to help carry it." The words were calm. They always were. That was the part that made them land harder than if she had shouted. I picked up the journal page and folded it again. "I used to drive out here almost every weekend," I said, "even when work was busy, even when I was tired. I thought that was enough. I thought showing up when I could and sending money when you asked was the same as being part of the decisions. I didn't realize you had already decided I wasn't." Brooke stood up and pushed her chair in. "You're making this into something it isn't. We're not against you. We're just done waiting for you to decide you have time for us." My mother nodded once, the same small motion she had used my whole life when a conversation was over. If you want to be part of what happens next, you can stay and listen. But if you're only here to argue about the past, then maybe it's better if you go home and think about what you actually want. I stood there for another minute, the journal page in my hand, the survey still in my bag. Then I turned and walked out. Uncle Robert was still by his truck. He watched me go but didn't say anything. I drove back to town with the radio off again, the same quiet that had followed me for weeks now, sitting heavier than before. That evening I sat on my couch with the survey and the journal page on the coffee table. I didn't turn on the lights. The house felt smaller than it had the day before. I thought about every weekend I had driven out without being asked, every time I had said yes to a repair bill or a phone call, even when I was already stretched thin. I had kept giving because I thought that was what family meant. I had kept showing up in the ways I could because I didn't want to be the one who let the distance grow. But the distance had already been growing for years, one quiet story at a time, told by the two people I trusted most to keep the truth straight. I picked up my phone and opened the family text thread. The last messages were from Brooke about the roof estimate and a time for the next meeting with Mr. Thompson. My name wasn't on the thread anymore. I hadn't noticed when it had been removed. I typed one message. I won't be at the next meeting. I won't be at the one after that either. If you need something from me that isn't about the property, you can still call. But I'm done pretending I'm part of decisions you've already made without me. I hit send before I could delete it. Then I turned the phone off and left it on the table. The weekend after that, I didn't drive out to the property. I stayed in town and did my laundry and went to the grocery store like it was any other Saturday. Mrs. Ellison waved from across the parking lot, but didn't come over. I didn't see my mother's car or Brooke's. The quiet felt different this time. It wasn't waiting to be filled. It was just there. The following Sunday, I woke up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with nothing in front of me except the old survey. I unfolded it and looked at the lines my father had drawn when I was still in school. The boundaries were still the same. Everything else had shifted without me noticing. I cried then, quietly at first, and then harder. The kind of crying that comes when you finally stop arguing with yourself about what you already know. I cried for the years I had spent trying to be enough by showing up when it was convenient, and for the way my mother and sister had let me believe that was the same as being wanted. I cried for the journal pages in the attic, and the conversations I had missed, and the relatives who now looked at me like I was the one who had walked away first. When the crying stopped, the house was still quiet. I folded the survey again and put it in a drawer. I didn't throw it away. I just stopped needing to look at it every day. I haven't been back to the property since. My mother hasn't called. Brooke hasn't texted. The spontaneous weekend visits I used to make without thinking are gone, and I don't miss the drive the way I thought I would. What I miss is the version of myself who believed that keeping the peace meant I had to keep giving, even when the giving was being used to write me out of the story. I still see Mrs. Ellison at the store sometimes. She asks how I'm doing in that careful way, and I tell her I'm fine. I still wave at Pastor Daniels on Sunday mornings when I go. I still work at the bank and come home to the same quiet house. The difference is that the quiet no longer feels like something I'm waiting to fix. My mother and sister are still handling the property. They're still the ones people in town ask when they want to know what's happening with the Mitchell land. I'm not part of those conversations anymore, and I've stopped trying to be. The manufactured image of a family that handled everything together with grace was never quite real, but it was easier to believe than the truth that had been sitting in my attic for years. I don't know what will happen to the property. I don't know if they'll sell part of it or keep it or let it fall into the same slow disrepair that comes when no one can agree. I only know that I'm not going to spend the rest of my life driving out there on weekends trying to earn a place at a table where the seats were already assigned without me. Protecting my peace didn't feel like wisdom at first. It felt like failure. It felt like the exact thing my mother had accused me of all along, choosing myself over the family. But the longer I sit with the quiet, the more I understand that my worth was never measured by how much of myself I could keep handing over. It was measured by whether I could finally stop. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace in a family that was already rewriting your place in it and protecting the version of yourself that still wanted to belong, what did you do? Would you have kept driving out on weekends? Or would you have stopped sooner?